I'm Kolohe Andino, and I'm answering a few questions from NBC News now. What are the rules? How are you scored for surfing? I think there's a lot of variables like wave size, amount of water you're throwing around, criticalness of the section of the wave. So yeah, that's actually a hard question. I'm still trying to figure that one out. What are you looking forward to watching besides surfing? I like the basketball. I like the gymnastics. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of like any of them that are just like the final and then there's American in it, or like an American that has a chance to win. So, all right. When was your first time on a surfboard? Probably when I was like a year old or 6 months old. My dad was a pro surfer, so he just had boards laying around. I think he used to put me on them and like ride me around the house.
It doesn't even work. They're huge.
No, they're small, only like 6 feet long.
Oh.
Can you explain some of your favorite maneuvers for us? I guess my favorite maneuver is to get barreled. So barrel, I guess, is when the wave is like heavy enough to like curl over instead of it like mushing. So when it curls over and breaks, you just like ride through it and like go the same speed as the wave. So you're kind of in the barrel. What are your goals for Tokyo 2020? Win gold. What are you most looking forward to experiencing in Tokyo besides the Olympics? I actually like the Japanese culture a lot. Just everyone is very respectful, and I actually like the food a lot. So, for someone who's never watched a surfing competition, what should viewers look out for? I guess falling. Falling is like pretty bad in surfing. Like if you fall on your wave, it's not a good score. Kind of no matter what you do. So. I guess completion of rides would be key. You were born and raised in the sport. Do you feel like it's finally getting some new attention it deserves? Yeah, I think surfing's definitely been a legitimate sport. I think stuff we do is pretty athletic. So yeah, it's right. It's in the Olympics, and it's getting a lot of notoriety for stuff we're doing. It's cool. What is your typical warm-up routine before going out into the water? Pretty standard stuff, just like loosening up and prepping the body for, I don't know, to compete. And also the mind, trying to calm the mind a little bit, because I guess surfing is a sport where you don't have a lot of control over things, so you gotta have a sound mind. I always like calming music. I feel like I'm overly excited already, so I try to calm myself. Who is your surfing inspiration? Surfing inspiration? I guess Kelly Slater. Pretty standard surfing inspiration for everyone. The GOAT, 48 years old and still going at it. So thanks again. It's Kolohe Andino. Looking forward to 2020 Tokyo. You can follow updates at USA Surfing's Instagram.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.